Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we're going to get into family crisis. So I want to start off differently.
That almost sounded like we were going to create a family crisis, Liz.
No.
We won't. We won't do that.
No, we're definitely not going to create a family crisis, but we're going to help. That's our main goal. This is a helping podcast, not a hurting one.
Right.
But I want to stray away from mental health for a second, and I want to talk specifically about the podcast. So this week marks 2 years since we started.
Okay. Wow.
Yes.
Time flies.
Right. And another really exciting achievement is we finally hit 100,000 downloads in total.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Congratulations.
Yes. And congratulations to you too. So I thought that was really exciting. And I wanted to share this with our listeners because we appreciate you guys so much. And we love when we get emails from you, and we love doing topics for you guys. And we just appreciate that you've been on this incredible journey with us. I mean, it's something that I have loved doing. And Mark, I'm sure you feel the same way.
I enjoy it a lot.
Yeah, this has been fantastic. All right.
As I've said to you, I can talk about a lot of things forever. So
I know.
That's never been my problem, right? Not being able to talk about something. So.
Oh yeah, we could talk about anything and turn it into mental health.
Right.
And then we'll make an entire episode or 3 about it.
Yeah.
So, all right. So on to family crisis. So we're going to start off by kind of talking about what constitutes as a family crisis, because I think that this is something that families will experience at least one time in their life, some sort of crisis or turbulent event or something that's going to put their family into upheaval. And I'll have a couple of recent examples myself, and I'll kind of walk you guys through why it maybe wasn't a severe crisis in my family. Some families will go through multiple crises throughout their lifespan.
And some, we'll get into, say, a chronic situation too, which is, something that just goes on through the lifetime. So it doesn't necessarily mean there are a lot of different crises that are happening. It's just you may have one that then continues for a very long time.
Yeah. Okay. So what constitutes a family crisis to you, Mark?
Well, I think it depends on the family.
Okay.
As we'll get, as we start to talk a little bit more about this model, I wrote some notes on our outline, and I think that we don't realize how much our perception colors the way we experience things. Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe a lot of people realize that perception is a lot in how we experience. But what I think I've used the term before of narrative, and we all create narratives in our lives. And the narrative we create about any particular event really could send it down the path of being a crisis or not a crisis. Mm-hmm. Now, some events are certainly, I think, would fall into that category of crisis. So, for instance, the one that comes to, there are many, but one that comes to mind is, say, the sudden death of a parent in a young family.
Yeah. I
don't think you could create a narrative where that's okay or where it's not a crisis.
Correct. Yeah.
And I think, I would think that could probably be a short-term or a long-term crisis. But, there are things that happen that are going to be crises. So if you think about your family life, and I would guess for a lot of our listeners, hopefully a lot of their life it goes along day to day, pretty kind of the same. We get into patterns. I would guess that for you and Curtis and your kids, that it's kind of that way, because that's the way it runs best, right?
Yep.
Even for Lindy and myself, we don't have kids in the home anymore. And so, but we have a pattern. And every once in a while we deviate from the pattern. So I think a crisis is something that throws you out of your typical pattern for a long time period. But I think a crisis is when someone in your family or in your circle is hurt in some way.
Yep.
So for instance, could be an emotional hurt, could be a physical hurt, could be some sort of abuse that you find out about. So I don't know that there's a good definition of what makes a crisis, but I think when we get into this model, I think the advantage of looking at models is it helps to get some clarity over
Yeah.
how you look at the events and how you can put them in some sort of structure. I think that's what a model does for us. It
Yes.
gives some sort of structure to what's going on in our lives. And often I think that's helpful for a set of that structure.
Correct. And so this model that we're going to reference, it comes from Robert Lauer's book, Marriage and Family, The Quest for Intimacy. And it's a textbook that I am currently reading for school. And there's a lot of really good information in this book that I like. And it is a textbook. So, I mean, if anybody is interested, they can, of course, go look it up. But I mean, just know that it's a textbook, right? And it's meant for academia study. And so it's very long. Right. It's
Right. And
very long.
usually textbooks are really pricey. I don't know if that, I mean,
Yeah.
at least when I was back in
Oh,
graduate school,
it's even worse now, probably.
they're incredibly pricey. So,
Yeah. This is called the ABCX model for family crisis. And it's A plus B plus C equals X. And so X being the crisis. And the book wasn't necessarily like they didn't really emphasize this point, but I think it's worth emphasizing that the difference between a serious crisis and maybe just a mini crisis. Because when I think of a crisis, I think I'll just start with a good example that we had in my family very recently, where my son woke up. He's 3.5 years old, and he woke up and his eyes were open, but he wasn't responding to anything. Something was very, very wrong. And I knew immediately. And we rushed him to the emergency room. And he was so severe, they didn't even ask his name. They took one look at him and they treated him right away. So it turned out to be hypoglycemic shock. His blood sugar had dropped below 20 and he spent the whole week in the hospital. So this is, I guess, what we could maybe call a mini crisis, because I mean, it definitely threw us out of our routine for that whole week because I'm gone all week. And, even just that event was traumatic for
right.
me and Curtis to to look at your 3.5-year-old son and say something is seriously wrong. And to ask yourself at this point, is it quicker to call 911 or do we just take you to the emergency room? That moment in itself is a crisis. Now, my family, we were able to navigate through that very smoothly. And we'll get into why that is. And I think it's because what Robert Lauer called a resilient family. And so we have resiliency in our family because we have good, strong emotional connections and we're all really bonded. We all work together and we're a team. And so, we were able to get through it. And my son is fine now. And that's really the most important thing. But that could have been considered a crisis. It's just not a long-term crisis.
No, it is a crisis and it is traumatic.
Yeah.
Certainly for you and Curtis, probably for the other siblings.
Yeah.
And certainly for your son, there's some trauma involved in that, being in a place where, it's confusing for a child to be in a hospital like that. Let me just, because hopefully I think you're going to define the A, B, C, and X, what that is. But I had a thought on models, and I think you and I have talked about models like this before. They're very popular in any graduate school program.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's just mental health programs. I think that in many programs that you have, and it could be finance, are going to be models, economics are going to be models, in mental health, they're going to be models. I think that it's good to get the information. It creates structure, as I said. I think when you actually get out and start practicing, I don't know that I have ever used a model. I don't know that anyone in our group has ever used a model either. So I don't know. I guess I'm questioning how practical they are.
Right.
But and I was thinking about this, and I think in some ways they are practical in that we're going to get into some of the different ways to approach a crisis based on this model. And I think what happens after you start practicing and this model, then some of these things just kind of happen. They just kind of, it's not like, oh, I'm going to follow this model.
Yeah.
It's almost inherently you start doing some of these things that create the structure. And I think that's probably true for many, at least mental health practitioners. If you're dealing with someone who's in a crisis, then you're going to go through some of these steps. I don't know that you say, oh, I'm following the ABCX model.
Right.
I think you're just following the steps. So maybe I have to retract my statement. The models aren't helpful. I think that they just become part of your practice, probably. And you don't ever say, oh, I'm following this model.
Correct. And to me, it's interesting, right? But I mean, everything is interesting to me right now because, this is a new field of study. And so it's really exciting. But I thought it would just be a good perspective for our listeners to have of this is the way therapists are looking at it. This is the way they're seeing and analyzing the information.
Well, I think it's important for listeners also. I think it's true. You could go online and probably Google ABCX crisis model and you'd get the exactly what we've got here. And so I think it's a good way to think about if you're in crisis or just for your information. I think it's a good way to approach looking at a crisis, even if you aren't a mental health practitioner.
That's true. Yeah. And I mean, knowledge is power. And as human beings, we love to have structure and we love to have meaning. We love to have labels. We like things to make sense. And I think models can help achieve that.
Right. And what does it give you? It gives you a sense of control.
Yes.
Right. That's what it gives you. Yeah. And that's what I think we love or we crave as a species, is control over our lives.
And I think that's what can be especially hard for kids. And so one of the things that I did to help my daughter through this crisis is because this happened at like 6:30 in the morning and she's getting ready to go to school. And so she's getting ready to get on the bus. And so the last thing she saw is us carrying her brother out the door, going to the emergency room. And I mean, she had no idea. And then she goes off to school like nothing happened. Right. And so, eventually later that day, a few hours later, I called the school and I said, hey, I need to talk to my daughter. This happened with her brother and I just need to let her know everything's okay. I couldn't help thinking she must be terrified. Like she has no idea and she just has to pretend like everything's normal. And that can be hard for a 10-year-old girl who loves her brother.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay. So this family crisis model. So A is the stressor event. So, for example, what happened with my son, right? That was our stressor event. He's rushed. Yes, he's rushed to the emergency room. B is the management of the stress through coping resources that the family has. So B is really resources, right? And so we immediately utilized our resources. Obviously, we utilized emergency services. We also utilized my father-in-law. He lives with us. And so family is an invaluable resource. And he's been an invaluable resource for us in the past as well. And then another resource that we utilized was community. So, I mean, we immediately were able to call upon some people from church to help us out, right? Yeah. I mean, we had somebody come that day to help Curtis give a priesthood blessing. And for those who are unfamiliar, it's a religious ceremony that involves prayer. And that was something that was important to Curtis. So that was certainly a resource that we utilized. And some people from church also brought us some meals and were just very, very supportive. And so resources are so important.
Right. Community is really important.
Yes. Yes. In a family crisis. All right. And so C is, I think, kind of a big one here. And that's the family's definition of the event. Right.
Which goes back to what I was trying to say earlier about perception and the narrative you create of it. And again, sometimes I think we do have control over how we view, a narrative. You give an example here, if about I think it's two families and one of them, maybe the father in each, they lose employment. And so,
so it's the Smiths and the Joneses. And so the Smiths define it as an undesirable, but also as a challenge. And so they decide that the family members will work together to do something to save money. And so B is the interaction of these three produce no serious crisis for them, which is X. Right. Whereas the other family, they describe it as disaster and they just expect, and they just expect. So, C, they'd look at it as a disaster. And then B is they just expect the father to figure out something to do, like figure it out, make some money. Come on, keep our lifestyle going.
Think of the pressure, right? That itself creates a pressure, which I mean, that's really hard. I mean, if you're going out and trying to find a job and you feel the pressure from everyone in your family. The community, I go back to community because, if you have a strong community, even in that type of situation, you can often call on the community to help out as
Mm-hmm.
well. And so a lot of it is how you handle it yourself in the
Mm-hmm.
family, but also it goes back to what resources you have.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so one of the things that somebody else came through and kind of modified this model a little bit, and they divided A into three different factors. So A
Okay.
being the stressor event. So they also added B, the hardship that accompanies the event, and then C, pileups. So you can have multiple things at once. Right. So, I mean, it's like everything happens at once. Like, let's say maybe somebody gets chronically ill and then somebody loses their job. And,
Yeah.
I mean, and then maybe there's something else going on. Maybe a kid is really struggling in school, or maybe a kid's getting in trouble with the law. That's a lot to happen all at once. Right.
Right. And
And
then often what happens with that type of cascade is that relationships start to suffer. And so even
yeah.
the parents, because there's so much stress in
Hmm.
the home because of these events, that sometimes sadly the relationship breaks down, which then
Yeah.
just becomes a whole nother crisis.
Yeah. And so I have another good example of this in my own family that we were able to navigate through that was a little bit of a bigger deal, I guess. I mean, it wasn't quite as traumatic as what we went through recently with our son, but it was still certainly a crisis in that it threw everything into an upheaval. And so this was the week of Thanksgiving. Everybody in my house got the flu. So I mean, that was kind of the first big thing is nobody felt good. Everybody felt sick, and the three adults in the house are so miserable. We didn't even bother cooking Thanksgiving dinner because we all felt so terrible. And so that weekend, my son ended up being in the hospital for dehydration, and he ended up having to stay for 2 days. And towards the end of his stay, I get appendicitis. And
Oh,
I
that's
and yeah,
oh,
I end up having emergency surgery.
right.
And so, it was just kind of like one thing after another. I mean, it was just bam, 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 bam. And so at the time I was working full time. And
Hmm.
so all of a sudden I'm out of a job for 2 weeks. Like I can't work for 2 weeks. And it's right around Christmas. We've got all of a sudden where it's like, well, now we're going to have a ton of these medical bills and I'm not going to work for 2 weeks. Right. It was a crisis for our
Hmm.
family,
Yeah.
but we have such great community resources. And in this instance our father-in-law was hands down our most valuable resource. We didn't even have to ask him. He just started getting up and getting our other two daughters ready for school. We didn't even
Hmm.
have to ask. He just did it. Right. And so he really stepped in and he just kind of took over where we needed him to. And then Curtis and Bill, my father-in-law, they really had to step up and do a lot because I mean, I spent pretty much a week in bed recovering from surgery, right? And so, again, it was a crisis, but once I was recovered from my surgery, we were good. I mean, things went back to normal and we were able to navigate easily through the crisis because we have strong relationships, we have strong bonds, we relied on our community. Now, I think that just as easily could have gone the other way,
Yeah.
right? I mean, Bill
Yeah.
and Curtis could have gotten bitter and resentful because here I am sitting around all day doing nothing. And not that, most people would generally be like that, but it can be hard. It can be frustrating. And so as frustrations mount, they're exhausted, they're tired, they maybe start to get snippy or short with people, and then this tension can form. And
Hmm.
so I can very easily see how a stressor event like that can cascade
Yeah.
and pile up and lead to more and more and more crises, right?
Right.
It
And
very
it's hard.
easily,
It's hard to dig yourself out
yeah,
from under the pile,
yep.
if it gets to be too big.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Okay, let's talk about coping methods because I think that's going to be the most effective. So in the book, they go into different types of stressor events. And I mean, we could spend a little time.
Okay. Can we just run through? I really like this actually. I
Okay.
like this
Yeah.
part.
All right. Yeah, let's do it.
And so I don't know that, and we'll go through it quickly so that
Yes.
we don't
Yeah.
run out of time. But what I like about it is I don't know that I would consider this necessarily part of this model. I think they're
Hmm.
just defining for people different types of events. And so I think for our listeners, it might be helpful to be able to, again, it's creating structure
Yeah.
around what these events are. So internal or external. So internal, something that comes from inside the family, external, something that comes from outside the family, earthquakes, terrorism, something economic, something that you can't
Hmm.
control. And so, internal, external is a way to look at it. Then the next one, normative or non-normative. And normative are those types of things that one can expect within the lifespan, like in the life cycle, birth, adolescent, launching out of the home, marriage, aging, death. Those are all things that we can expect. Or non-normative, getting a divorce, dying young, a war, being taken hostage, things like that.
Yep.
And those are non-normative. Then they have ambiguous or non-ambiguous. So ambiguous events for which you can't get a clear picture of the clear facts. And I think this does happen sometimes because I've heard clients talk about, often it's in terms of, say, someone else in their family that they don't really know what's going on
Yeah.
and that's ambiguous. They know there's something happening, but they don't know what it is. And then non-ambiguous are just the opposite, events for which there are very clear facts available, what's happening, how long, to whom. So again, I think, if you could choose, you'd want a non-ambiguous crisis.
Hmm.
You'd want to have the knowledge. As you said, knowledge is power. Volitional or non-volitional. Volitional would be something that's sought out. So for instance, if you choose to change jobs. Now, some people might think of that as a crisis. Going to college might be a crisis. Maybe there's financial obligation associated with that, or
Hmm.
even the one that is called, they list a wanted pregnancy. So a lot of
Yep.
people want to get pregnant. I don't know that that falls into the category. I wonder about the term volitional, that maybe if it's volitional, it's not really going to be a crisis. What do you think
Well,
about that?
I think it can be, but
It can be hard.
it can be a stressor event that
It can be a
starts
stressor
the
event,
crisis.
but it's not the crisis, right?
I think so. What I would guess is that it could be the catalyst, right? So like
Oh, okay, yeah.
you start a
Okay.
new job and it doesn't work out. Now you've got a crisis. You get pregnant, right? You're trying to get pregnant and you miscarry. Now you're in a crisis. So
Okay.
maybe
Okay.
that's what it's referring to, is these events can be a catalyst.
Right. Okay. And then non-volitional, we've talked about some getting laid off from your job, or maybe the sudden and unexpected death of a loved one. And then a chronic situation is one that goes on,
Hmm.
for a long period of time. And so if you had, oh, they mentioned like in this, diabetes,
Yep.
some sort of chemical addiction. The interesting one, racial discrimination, which we don't talk about a lot, but there are certainly segments of our population where they face racial discrimination every day, every
Hmm.
single day. And so that's a
Hmm.
chronic stressor, chronic crisis for them, as opposed to acute, which is something that lasts a short time. So I think just having those definitions of different events for me is kind of helpful. And so hopefully
Yep.
listeners might find it helpful. Okay, on to coping. How do we cope?
Yes. Yes. So, and another thing that we talked about earlier is that not all stressor events are equal,
Right.
right? And so
True.
you take for the example of my two family crises that I mentioned. I mean, one was maybe more traumatic, but was actually a little easier to navigate through because it was just shorter. Whereas the one that happened back in November, this pileup, I mean, Bill and Curtis are already exhausted from recovering from the flu. And now here they have to do extra stuff to help take care of me while I'm recovering from surgery, And so in some ways that was a bit of a harder crisis, at least as far as everybody. So now Lauer breaks coping patterns into two categories: ineffective and effective. So, and I think it's so easy, or I guess one thing that I think it's okay to kind of go through these in cycles, right?
Hmm.
I think you can very easily cycle through these ineffective and effective coping mechanisms, especially if it's a long-term crisis, right? Or if it's maybe like something that's like chronic. For example, you have a child who's diagnosed with diabetes.
Yeah.
That, that's something that's going to be lifelong to deal with. And so I think that in these instances, this information is good to have, and it's good to recognize these effective versus ineffective, but just realize that you're probably going to spend some time in these ineffective coping strategies, and it's okay, and you can correct.
Right. And I hope it's minimal time because
Yes.
they really are hard. And I've seen this. And so one example that I have is a couple who are struggling with their own relationship issues, but then they had an adolescent son who had some substance abuse issues.
Mm-hmm.
And they got stuck in the scapegoating. So here are the three ineffective: denial, avoidance, and scapegoating.
Yeah.
And so often you might get one parent in this situation, for instance, there was never any denial, but there was certainly avoidance, like, okay,
Yeah.
we have to deal with this. And there was certainly scapegoating. And the problem with that is that it really takes your attention away from what the real issue is. The real issue is your son is struggling and he has a substance abuse problem. And if you're dealing with scapegoating, then what you're doing is you're probably blaming each other,
Yep.
or avoidance, not really taking it seriously. And so what happens is that, let's say parents the primary relationship, that relationship starts to fracture,
Mm-hmm.
which makes it very, very difficult. And this was very difficult for this particular couple. And it didn't tank the relationship, but it almost did.
Yeah.
And they really came through it well after
Mm-hmm.
a while. So I think, those three are very ineffective, and you should try to avoid those especially the scapegoating. The
Yeah.
scapegoating is just blaming, you know,
Yeah.
this is something you did that caused this problem. Very, it
Unhelpful.
just doesn't it's not helpful in that moment.
And I would say that in any instance, scapegoating is not going to help. I mean, and you can apply that to anything. I mean, think of a loss of a job. Blaming the person who lost their job
Right.
is not helpful, right?
No, I think that what can be helpful, though, is after you've resolved the crisis,
Yeah.
you can go back and approach it in terms of what could we or what could you have done differently to maybe change this so that you learn from it.
Sure.
But I wouldn't call that scapegoating or blaming. I would just say you're trying to learn from whatever happened so that it becomes less likely it's going to happen again.
Yes. Now, denial and avoidance, those can be a little trickier to avoid. I mean,
Hmm.
or at least maybe mentally, right? I mean, because sometimes you can't always deny a problem that's right in front of you, but I think it's sometimes easy to maybe try to deny the severity of it. So
Yeah.
the example that you mentioned, you might think, well, our son's not that bad. His drug problem isn't that bad.
That's what I hear, in fact. Exactly. From
Right.
one parent, usually, not both.
But it's not helpful
No, it's
to do
not.
that, or
It's not.
avoiding, which, and that could also be a form of avoidance as well. It's not that bad, so maybe we don't need to do anything about it. Or,
Right.
you maybe don't take enough of an aggressive approach in
Hmm.
that instance. So
Exactly. That's why I think those three, they're ineffective. I think sometimes they can be harmful.
yes. And I mean, with the denial and the avoidance, I mean, try to recognize if you get into that, because I think it's going to be very common in a long-term crisis, because it's going to be hard. You're going to want to deny it. You're going to want to avoid it because it's not pleasant. And as human beings, we want to avoid unpleasant things. So just be aware and try to pay attention to if you're getting in those cycles.
Hmm. Yeah.
So effective coping mechanisms. And I think the first one is probably the most important one, and that's take responsibility.
Yeah. Yeah.
And go
This
ahead.
ties into, I've mentioned this before with couples work with Gottman. He says the best way to handle, say, a crisis in the couple or a conflict is for you to take responsibility. It
Yeah.
just makes everything easier after that. And that's probably the reason. I wonder if that's the reason they list it first, is
Hmm.
that when you take responsibility, it tends to make everything that comes after it easier.
Yeah. Yep.
And I think I
Exactly.
think what happens if you take responsibility, this is an obvious statement. I realize that then the scapegoating doesn't happen.
Yes. Yes.
The blaming doesn't happen. Yeah.
Yeah. Correct. So the next one is affirm your own and your family's worth. And so this one, I think positive affirmations. We know that gratitude or trying to stay positive is good for mental health, even
Yeah.
when it's hard. And I know it can be so hard to find the positive, but I mean, it's important to do that. And it's important to say to your family, this is tough right now, because again, you don't want to deny it or avoid it. You need to say, this is hard, but the important thing that we're going to focus on is we're going to focus on being together. We're going to focus on being a family, and we're going to focus on working through this
Yeah.
hard time, right? So you're
Well,
affirming your love for each other.
right. And it tends to pull you together into
Yes.
into a common cause.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so the third one, balance self-concern with other concern. This is a tricky one because it can be so easy when you're going through a family crisis to get really caught up in yourself and I need this and I need this and I need this. Well, you do have needs and you do need your own coping mechanisms, but consider your spouse's needs too and consider your children's needs, right? Don't neglect other people's needs in pursuit of, your own coping mechanism.
Right. And I think that you mentioned this briefly, but I think it's important. Often we don't think about our own needs. And
That's true.
eventually that catches up with you.
Yeah.
If you're just focused on others, and you're not taking care of yourself,
Yeah.
and you can do that short term. I think long term it becomes really problematic.
And a pitcher with a hole in the bottom of it isn't going to hold water.
Nope.
And so you can't give water to other people if your pitcher's got a hole in it. So, don't be the pitcher with the hole in it. Plug your
Yep.
hole, take care of yourself,
Yep.
and then you can
Yep.
help others. You can help the rest of your family. So you make a really good point, Mark, is don't neglect
No.
yourself in terms of a crisis.
I think that's really easy for mothers to do.
Oh, yeah.
And that's what I've seen. And I know I'm making a generalized statement, but I think that mothers have a harder time looking at their own needs
And making time
they're always
for it.
focused on the others. Yeah.
Or making time to take care of themselves. I mean, I've heard this before where I've recommended, I'm like, to a friend, I'm like, you got to do something for yourself. She's like, I don't have time. And I'm just
Well, you
like,
got to make time.
I'm like, you have to,
No one's going to give it to you.
yeah, it's like you have to make time. You have to figure something out because your tank is empty and you're driving the family car and you're not going to get very much farther on this empty tank.
No, you aren't.
Yeah, I love a good analogy. Okay. So this next one, you kind of touched on this a little bit. That's learn the art of reframing.
And so reframing is just changing the narrative.
Yep.
Changing how or your perception,
Yeah.
which we have total control over.
Yes.
It's often that I'll talk to clients about that. Yes, you're looking at it this way, but you could also you could reframe it to look at this way. So reframing is often a word that mental health professionals use. And I like changing the narrative. For some reason, it makes more sense to people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so one thing that's been helpful for me in accepting things is, I guess, just saying, this is the way it is. This is my life now. This is what I have to do. And so I thought of this in terms of, Curtis when he was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes at a young age, which was terrifying. And, again, we have a pretty solid relationship. I don't think it felt like a major family crisis, but, we both had to accept this is our life now. Paying attention to carbs, making healthier choices. This is what we have to do. Right. Yeah. And so it's a sort of reframing of just accepting this is your life now and finding ways to cope and to be okay with it.
Yeah.
All right. So this last one, I think, is probably the most crucial, and that is find and use available resources. And, they are there. And I think especially in terms of families who are faced with disability, there are so many resources, especially kids.
So I think that, the word that comes to mind when I look at that is community again. And I know I've said it before. I just think community is so important, which I think extended family and community. But, looking at the available resources, I think one of the things that maybe can come out of this for our listeners is that if you start thinking about, it's not like you should dwell on the potential of crises coming up, but if you think about, okay, what are my resources so that, who can I call in time of need? And then, it's kind of up there in your head that when something happens, then you're already, primed to actually go for the resources. So it's good to think about it, I think, a little bit.
And I think it's also helpful to, and I'm not saying dwell a lot in the what if, but, ask yourself, how would I handle this situation? What would I do? And it might even be a good conversation to have with your partner, your spouse. Hey, how do you think we would handle this situation if this
Mhm.
happened? And maybe go through some of these things of what resources could we use in this situation, or how would we define this event? How would this event affect our family?
Mhm.
Those kinds of things. I think that could be a helpful dialogue, or at
Yep.
least an open dialogue about it could create intimacy, if nothing else.
Right. And I think this reminds me of something that all parents with children who live in a home or apartment should do. You say, okay, you don't want to make your child afraid of a fire, but you want to
Yep.
say, in the event of a fire, what are we going to do?
Yes.
And so you have a plan. And sometimes, every once in a while you practice the plan.
Yep.
And so all you're doing is preparing for something that might happen, and hopefully it will never happen.
I
So
live in Indiana, and so we have to say, what do we do in the event?
tornadoes.
Yes, what do we do in the event of a tornado? What's our
Yeah.
family going to do? And
Yeah.
so, and last week we got really good practice because it was a Monday afternoon and we had some stormy weather and the sirens started going off, and so it was a good opportunity to navigate the what if. I mean, thankfully no tornado, or there was no significant damage, and I don't think a tornado actually touched down near us, but it was certainly frightening to our kids, right?
Sure.
I mean,
Yeah.
and so it's a good opportunity to say, what's our plan? If we're at home and we get a tornado warning, what are we going to do,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And so it's a similar thing for other crises. So think about it and, think about what you would do. Yeah.
Yeah, it can be helpful. All right. So next week, we are going to get into nutrition and mental health. So Mark suggested this topic, and I eventually cringed a little bit because I was like, maybe I need this topic.
Okay. I think we have program notes, don't we, Liz?
Yes.
That you could. So in this program note, I'm going to give you 3 different podcasts. So our listeners, if they're interested, can go to these podcasts before, and they're all with a guy I've mentioned before. His name's Andrew Huberman.
Mm-hmm.
And the first one is with a psychiatrist, Chris Palmer. And that's the one I'm going to be focusing on the most because there's some really interesting research that's going on about what we eat and how it can positively change our mental health, things like schizophrenia,
Okay.
even, or depression and anxiety. There's another one, Andrew Huberman, called Food and Emotions. And then the third one is Andrew Huberman, Gut and Brain Health. And we've known for quite a while that what they call the gut biome, I think is how they describe it, what goes on in the bacteria that's in our gut actually can affect our anxiety and depression, which a lot of people don't realize.
Well, if you think about it, your blood sugar is going to affect it too. If your blood sugar drops, you get cranky. That's mental health.
Anyway, I find it really interesting. I think it's fascinating, the connection between what we eat and our mental health, because I think it's very real. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we all need food. We all got to eat. Yep. And so we're either going to do it right or not so right.
That's right.
All right. We will see you all next week.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.